So hi everyone, welcome to this webinar, Getting Started with Provar. My name is Hetty Ballman-Weston and I'm the Head of Marketing here at Provar. Presenting with me today, I also have Richard Clark and Geraint Waters, who I'll be passing over to in just a minute. So as you know, this webinar today is all about getting started with Provar and Salesforce test automation. If we take a quick look at the agenda to start things off, we're going to begin by talking about some of the common challenges that we face in testing the Salesforce platform and telling you about some of the ways that Provar set up to tackle those challenges. We'll spend most of today's time in the product itself, so we'll be doing some Provar demos, and in those demos we'll be covering some UI testing, some API and data-driven testing, as well as looking at how Provar supports the end-to-end, including reporting and its use in a continuous testing context. And then finally, we'll give you an overview of Provar's licensing model and pricing. So the webinar is due to last 45 minutes and we should have some time for questions at the end. So if you'd like to ask a question at any point, please feel free to do so. You can do that by typing into the questions box and I'll try and make sure that these are all picked up at the end of the session. So this webinar is being recorded, so I will send the video around to all attendees tomorrow, and you're welcome to then watch it again or share it with any team members that may be interested. Before I hand over, just a final marketing plug from me. Provar will be at French Touch Dreamin' next month, and that's a Salesforce community event which is being held in Paris. So we'll be exhibiting at that event and we'll also be presenting 2 different sessions on test automation. So do keep an eye out for us if you're going to be attending, or let us know if you would like to meet up. It should be a really good event. So that's it from me. I'll hand over to Geraint for the presentation.
Thank you, Hetty. So yes, I am Geraint Waters. I'm the Provar product manager. So I'm just going to go through a few slides now, just talking about Provar and sort of the space we're in, and also I will be doing some demos before handing over to Richard. So this first slide is really talking about what space we're in right now. So we've been obviously working with Salesforce testing for some time, and our view of the world is there's an awful lot of manual testing that's going on at the moment, but also, you know, bigger and bigger projects are on the platform, and obviously with agile developments, the backbone of that really is good processes. So that's good, easy ways of deploying reliably and easy ways of testing reliably, because genuinely I don't think we've got enough time on these 2-week sprints in order to do our manual testing anymore. So things are just getting either not run or essentially basically missing our dates. So we all understand that we're on this call, we all like the thought of test automation. I'd say there's 2 main options you could use outside of Provar, and that is the fact you could go ahead and employ some developers, and you might use open source technology such as Selenium in order to code a solution for your test automation. That approach is fine. I think the big problem is, and it's the same problem as the generic test tools have, things like UFT and these other products, is they really struggle to test Salesforce. I guess the question is, why is that the case? A lot of people have tried, and a lot of people find their tests are very brittle. And the reason is the locators in Salesforce are very easy to break if you're just using the HTML on the page. The problem there is, and the same for Classic and for Lightning, is that actually you configure Salesforce, you make your sort of own code, you do your configurations, and you're not in control of how the website is presented. So the problem is, in the case of Classic, is you tend to find there's Salesforce IDs in the field. When you change environments, what you find is those IDs are different. Also for Lightning, you tend to find it's based on the Aura open source framework. Those IDs are alphanumeric and actually are also wrapped up in a lot of frames as well now. So again, these are the things that catch people out for their sort of test execution. So in addition to that, we have complexity. Now, that complexity is that we have things like visual force pages, we have custom Lightning components. And again, what we find there is there's a domino effect. So you might make the smallest of changes to those pages, and the annoying thing is that it knocks out every single field within that page. So if anyone's been trying to attach themselves onto that, they might find that release to release, they've just got more maintenance that they see as palatable. On top of that, we also have consoles to think about in Salesforce, and again they have lots of tabs, and those tabs are equally full of iframes that need to be switched into. Lastly on this slide is really reusability. From the perspective of if you are on a classic project, it's inevitable you'll be moving to Lightning at some point. If you do that with any other sort of custom framework, you will find that you'll probably have to start your test automation again because the applications are so different. Good news is with Provar, we do have test cases which actually understand classic and Lightning, and you can actually change between them. So let's sort of spend some time now looking at Provar. Key thing about the tool is it's very quick to get set up and started. So we're not sort of sitting down on day one having to do a framework and think about how to set everything up. Everything is really there for you. So we can be starting building our test cases straight away after our training. The other key thing about the tool is it's no code. So it really means that it does open up the tool to the business analysts, the admins, the developers. Everyone can sort of understand what these test cases are doing, and people can move between teams and fully understand, test cases very quickly because they're very Englishly readable. The final point, which I think is absolutely vital, is that as a company, we're aligned to the Salesforce roadmap. What that really means is that we are in a position where all the Salesforce releases come along, we get the pre-release. We're keeping you immune from certain changes. So in the last release, multi-pick lists changed, for example, back to a more classic look and feel. Provar does that work for you. In addition to that, all of our customers are Salesforce customers. So we're forever sort of gladly receiving, say, enhancement requests from these customers, and it just serves to actually make the product stronger and actually able to do smell source in a much more smarter way in the future. In addition to that, we have lots of Salesforce features we can test. So obviously we've been doing Classic for some time, and now we're moving much more into the Lightning space where we're doing lots of Lightning components. We're also starting to roll out our mobile testing on device as well. So the key benefits of Provar is really around metadata. So, a lot of those problems I mentioned earlier about unreliable testing, finding things on the screen are really borne by the fact that, we do more than test just against the HTML of a page. And that's really where we attach ourselves into your org, we pull down that metadata, and that metadata tells us where fields are on a layout. Now, why that's really good is because inevitably you move things around, you add things to your layout. And actually, because we're dynamically attached to that metadata, we still refine those fields, which is a really big time saver. It means that when things fail, they fail for a reason. It's probably because they mean some maintenance based on the functionality. The other thing about the product is it is a desktop product, and that's quite important. Reason being is that we want to test much more than just Salesforce. We need to be able to test your end-to-end as well. Now, if we are in the cloud, we would struggle to get past firewalls. We wouldn't be able to test your databases, your sort of intranet, all those type of things that are vital as part of an end-to-end system integration test. The other thing as well is just generally, you're not having to worry about your data security as well. It's not that Provar has a cloud storing all your data. It's all local to you. On top of that, we have lots of inbuilt APIs and functions. That's very useful because we are a no-code tool. It doesn't mean we can't say looping. We need to do date manipulation. We can do string functions. All those things are available in the product and very easily drag and droppable. And then finally, of course, we've got cross-browser testing, which is vital for sort of doing all our complete testing. Now, another thing that's actually very sort of specific to us really is API testing on Salesforce. So we're quite passionate about Salesforce testing, and we think that we can do more than just take our manual tests and then put them into a UI test, which you tend to find a lot of that. Now, what I would recommend is we do deterministic testing, which basically means you set up your data before you start using it in your test. And so, certain elements have to be done in the UI. So that might be sort of JavaScript, dependent pick lists, any custom code you've got. But actually creating the data so that the situation is exactly right for that test. Sometimes it's what I would call seed data. And that seed data in Salesforce can be created much quicker in an API test. So this is drag and drop. I'll show you as part of the demo. We can create that data that can still run your validation rules. It still runs your triggers. It just means that it runs sort of within seconds and not minutes. So you're setting up data really, really quickly. Then you can launch your UI and look around your browser. And then finally, you can delete all that data using our APIs for sort of clearing up data. So I think that's really nice that you've got best of both worlds. We can also do SQL queries. That's really useful for integration testing. So we're able to actually check, did some data get written back to Salesforce, for example. We can do execute anonymous, which is vital for sort of checking. We can run Apex snippets. That's useful for maybe if you've got batches and you want to run them now. And we've also got Apex Bulk, which is useful for loading and migration testing, that type of thing. So let's have a quick look at Provar. First thing I'm going to show you is just really around the lead creation and conversion, which is probably a pretty common scenario for people. I think as part of that, we'll have a look at some global search and checking data, and then finally also sort of looking at some custom Lightning components as well. So let's go and have a look at Provar. What we can see is this is Provar desktop. There's lots of different views here, and they're all very interesting and do different functions, but we'll get around some of that today. What I've actually got in the middle of the test there is a test case that's already running. But what I want to do is actually create myself a unique name. And in order to do that, what I've got is actually a callable test over here. And I can just drag callable tests into my test like this. Now, what a callable test is you can actually take repeatable steps and make them into like a function. If I double click into this, you'll see this is super simple. All it's doing actually is creating me a variable, and that variable has a unique ID in it. So that's quite common in what we want to do in our testing, is we don't want to always sort of end up with the same data in the org. It's very hard to know which execution that was. So that's a pretty typical thing we'd want to do. Now, what I've also done is launch this test using Test Builder. So what we can see is for Test Builder, we've got Electron.js application on the right-hand side, and it's really visible. We know exactly what's happening when we're authoring, and we've obviously got Salesforce on the left-hand side. What we've also got is these buttons over here, so I can actually step forward with these buttons if I want to run a test. So I did an API call there, of course, with my callable test, and that's now obviously created my variable now. So I now have my company name, and it will have a unique element to it. Now, if I want to start creating my lead now, I'm just going to right-click on the button, for example, and choose Add to Test Case. And what you notice in Test Builder is it wakes up and tells me what it knows about this field. So this is in preference to anyone who may have used record playback type of tools, where you just do lots of clicking and all the sorts of stuff you want to do in the browser, and it spits out a script at the other side, usually with lots of sleeps in it. Now, our approach is that we say, look, you should be knowledgeable about how we're mapping this field. We should review that. And what we're saying is this is the Salesforce lead home that's coming from metadata. This is the new button. You can see it knows the rest of the things from this particular screen immediately in the drop down. And then we've got the interaction type, which is actually the test responsibility to think about again. So here I'm going to default to click, and actually that's what we're going to choose. But if there happens to be an alert behind it, we'd have click and confirm. If it was a PDF doc, we would download it now and we could check the doc, hover over it for tooltips, right click, double click, read assert or drag and drop. And then finally, we've also always got the option to do screenshots before or after, or hover, for example. Now, if I choose add and do, what happens in Provar, it writes down my test step and then executes it for me. And as it's one of the first UI steps, it also refreshes the page, just because it sort of does the dynamic URL navigation for us as well, so reduce clicks. And then the process really is, as we go into our lead, for example, we just right click again and do add to test case. This time it tells us it's the lead new screen. It's doing a set command. For a set, I could choose to press tab or press enter afterwards, and it's just add and do each time. So I'm just going to put in the minimum fields really here, and we'll go ahead and add a last name and then add our company. Now the company is the field that we've already created as a variable, and I'm going to use that. So let's just firstly add my last name. We'll use my last name and add and do. And then what we'll do is we'll choose our company. Now, in order to add my variable here, and that's the thing, we want to variabilize and functionize as we go along. I'm actually just going to put a bit of a placeholder here and choose add. And then we go back to Provar desktop, and we're going to choose to use our variable. Control spacebar brings up my functions, but also you'll see down here we've got company name as a variable now. And straight away, we can see that reflected in Test Builder. And if I choose next, what we notice is it writes in this sort of dynamic element to my name, and you can see it sort of overwrites the new value over here. So that's me done on the lead. I'm now actually just going to choose save on here, and we'll create the lead. Hopefully we get into the swing of the sort of right click on the elements now. Now at any point now I could choose to check some data. So for example, I could choose to say, okay, let's just make sure that the name value is correct. If you did have any logic around this, we can always do assert. So we can see here, we have read assert here. I can pull out the value and check the value. Also notice that we could be checking labels in Salesforce views. We can also be doing the message if there's a field level or page level error message here. And we can also be checking attributes such as, was it visible, etc. So these are all different options. And again, just from a Salesforce layout, everything's coming from metadata. Now, again, if we want to do this check now, we can just choose add and do, and that will check our data for us in the case of Mr. Waters. Now, the other thing you may want to do is check inline edits, and that's again obviously something we support in Provar. And what we need to do here is we will right-click, and let's just maybe update the lead status here. Right-clicking into this field, add to test case, and again, one of the options we've got on our interaction type down here is start inline edit. We can also set by index, so we can actually choose the second in the list if we want to. But let's start the inline edit, and we can see we're into edit mode, and I can just choose, instead of new, I'd like to say contacted in this particular example, and then add that data into my test case and choose add and do. Finally, we're just going to hit save, and what we'll do is we'll convert this lead. So here we go. And again, from the conversion perspective, what we expect to see is these are all sort of standard buttons up here for us. We fully understand these from metadata, and we're able to sort of choose to execute that, add and do. And we get ourselves into the conversion screen. Now I'm just going to take the defaults in this case and just choose to convert. Add and do. And this next screen is actually something where it's an example of where, you know, Provar will use metadata where it can, but actually this screen isn't really covered by metadata. So on occasions you'll see Provar will fill those gaps for us. On other occasions, we've always got the option to add our own locators. So add to test case here, what we'll see is we can override this from Salesforce to page object, and we're now able to see that basically Provar can pick this up using other mechanisms. So this is suggesting that I'm going to add a new locator to something called a page object. So that's our container for these extra locators. And what we're seeing is Provar's offering us an Aura by locator, which is a very smart way. It's actually using the thing that the developer's given us here, and we're actually choosing to write that down. Now we always have options. You can see we could go by label, go XPath. So these are the other things you can also do if you need to. So if you were using a custom framework, they would be your only options, whereas Provar is providing much more enhanced options such as the Aura by. And again, if we choose add and do here, what we'll see is Provar is able to write that down as a step and then execute that for us, and then hopefully take us through to the next screen. Now at this point, what you'll see is that we might want to look up the opportunity, because of course we're still on the lead view list here. Now if we wanted to do a search, what we're able to do is right click on here, choose add to test case, and exactly the same as we did before, I'm going to put a placeholder here, because again, we know the company name we're going to look up here. That was the reason why I put the variable in place. Now, what I also need to do for searching is press enter afterwards, because of course there's no sort of button. There is a button up there, but I'm going to choose to hit press enter afterwards, which is what a user might do. So if I choose add now, that's now sort of getting to the point where, again, it's not going to run it, but what I need to do is choose my variable from the list here. So if we look down to the search box, I can choose control spacebar, go and find my company name field, save that down, and then we'll run that. So again, you can sort of see we've got examples where we're able to do these sort of API steps, and we're able to manipulate our tests in Provar Desktop and then just immediately run it in Test Builder. And then from here, what we're able to do is see that we've now got a Flexi page. And if we want to just give an example of how we interact with things like Flexi pages, if I wanted to check the data in here, for example, what you'll see is Provar will pick up the fact that this is a Flexi component. It immediately spots that actually I can find this using metadata. And then again, we might just want to check that actually this is the right account name here, for example. So I could just choose to pull out the value, check the value in the same way as we've done before. And that just keeps added to our test. So whether that's custom, whether that's metadata, Provar does a smart job of finding this information. So let's just flip back to our slides and continue with what we've just learned. So what we will see is from Test Builder's perspective, it's a very sort of straightforward and visible way of creating our test cases. I think the other key thing is that Provar will sort of do the login to Salesforce automatically for you. So we're not having to worry about login screens. It automatically finds the application under test for you. We don't just leave it to chance. And also, you can see you've seen the inbuilt support for Salesforce screens, and obviously we've seen Lightning today, but it equally works well on Classic. So the next demo I want to do is now completely different from the UI testing. I just sort of show you how we can do API testing quite smartly as well, and that will actually loop into sort of doing some data-driven testing. So what this will be is now creating a lead via the API this time, and also we'll be using Excel, but we could equally be using a database if we wanted to. So let's shoot back to Provar. And actually in this case, let's go ahead and create a brand new test. So new test over here is the button we need. I'm going to create, we'll call it our lead API test. And I don't need Test Builder actually for this because it is going to be a 100% API test. And I'm just going to choose finish for that. So what we see is we've now got a placeholder of a test case in the middle of my screen. Now, what we've got in the bottom right-hand corner here is our org browser, and you can see I've clicked on the lead object already. Now, if I drag in my data from the org browser, you get the menu that says create, read, update, and delete, or sock call. I'm going to choose create. What that actually gives me is a clone of the data I just dragged, which is really interesting. So you can see all this data is coming for free. So that's quite useful, number one. I think equally, I want to maybe make this data driven. So what I'm going to do is go over to my test APIs, and I'm actually going to drag in a group step. Now, a group step is actually just good for comments. But why it's nice is this case, I can make it very obvious that I'm actually reading data from Excel. And on top of that, what I'm able to do is actually grab a range of data. And this is using a parameter value source. Now, what I'm going to do is open up my Excel sheet, which I've actually got under templates. So we've launched that, we've got our Excel. I'm going to grab the range for this particular sheet. And then what I'm going to do is choose this little pointy arrow. And what that does is it snapshots that range in here. And I just need to be careful to also update where I think the columns are in this sheet. Now, the final thing I want to do is, I've got 3 rows in that sheet, and I want to have 3 leads from that. And in order to achieve that, I need a for each. So if I drag a for each into my test, this is going to do the looping for me. Now I'm going to drag in this within, so I need to have the step as a child to my for each. And the next thing I need to do is say, well, what is the list I'm looping? And it's Excel data. That's the variable Provar is giving it by default. And then I can just say I want a value name of row. The important last thing to do is to obviously use the information I've read in. So what I need to do is replace this hard coding for last name, choose row, dot, and then we can choose last name from the list. We automatically know the columns because we've read it in. Then I can choose first name, so I can choose row dot first name, and then we can just finish off. We don't have to do every column here for sake of time. We can choose to go for company. So that's pretty much it. And hopefully what we'll see if we run debug is quite quickly we can connect into Salesforce, read out our range of data, and then what we'll do is loop through those 3 rows and keep continuing to create leads for us. So again, it's pretty quick. I think it's saying 3 seconds to run all that through. And you can hopefully see if you had a sheet in your Excel of 500 rows, it really could chug through a lot of data there. So that's really the second demo I wanted to show you. Again, what we saw is just how quickly it is to create data with API steps, and also how easy it is to hook in Excel should we need to. And finally, hopefully sort of glimpse of some of the API steps. We only used group steps, but there's plenty more in there that we're able to use to enrich our test cases. So I'm going to say thanks to everyone now. I'm going to hand over to Richard, and he's going to be talking us through end-to-end testing.
Thank you, Garrett. I hope that was very useful to everyone. So Garrett's been showing us how we can author new tests. And we saw 2 examples, the UI testing and the API testing. Actually, you can combine the 2 as well. And you can also use many of the other functions we've got to sort of bulk load lots of data, which might be your testing, have you bulkified your application. And I see one of the questions that came through is, are we a performance test tool? No, we're not a performance test tool in that we're going to spin up multiple agents and try and stress test Salesforce. And if you try and do that without Salesforce's permission, you will end up being blacklisted. So please, if you're planning to do that, do consult with Salesforce first and ask their permission. But what we can do is inject lots of data, and we can do it in a way that can test in terms of bulk operations and things like that. So I'm going to talk to you about the end-to-end testing capabilities of Provar in terms of testing other things than Salesforce. And I also want to talk to you about how we fit Provar into a continuous delivery life cycle. So whether you've got a DevOps implementation, you're following a strategy for continuous releases, how we can integrate Provar into that. Firstly, when it comes to Provar testing, as well as testing Salesforce, there's a number of other systems and applications we can hook into that Garrett's already mentioned. So we can look into a database that you've already got. So we can hook into those databases to create read operations, writing values that maybe trigger an integration process into Salesforce, or checking results that are coming from Salesforce as a result of integration into those. So you can validate your test cases not just through the browser, but on an end-to-end basis. In a similar way, when it comes to email, whether you've got Microsoft Exchange or Gmail, we can hook into those platforms as well. So we can validate that your messages are being sent to customers or users based on the event logic you want to test. And we can even validate the content of those emails is correct as well. Maybe you're checking for merge fields that haven't been replaced, for example. And then when it comes to other business applications, basically anything that runs in a browser, we can also test. Now, we don't have metadata for things like Siebel, SAP, and Workday, but you can still test any business application, any website application, including any marketing automation landing pages you've got that might be driving that lead process we saw just now. So anything that works in a browser, using our Slim web drivers, we can test those things as well using our page object pattern. And then we just saw an example of how we can pull in data from an Excel spreadsheet, which equally could have been a database source, but we can also use the Excel spreadsheet to have expected results. And we can actually write those sources as well. So we can write back the actual results if we wanted to into that same spreadsheet, which is incredibly powerful. And then finally, we've got web services. So using any REST or SOAP web services, you've seen how we do that with Salesforce pre-built services for the S-object CRUD functions. Basically, anything that has an endpoint that's reachable, we can also test. So again, that can be causing a process to trigger as part of an integration. It could be querying some data as a result of some integration that you've included in your testing scope. And then if that's not enough for you, Provar as a platform can be extended. So we have an open framework for writing your own APIs. And we use that ourselves for supporting things like Squid, for Salesforce CPQ, Velocity, CloudSense, any other application that we want to include that's on the Salesforce ecosystem, or any other application such as ServiceMax that we want to test as well. So we can include all those or write your own. So now I want to talk about continuous testing. So when we talk about continuous testing, we're talking about this middle piece of the DevOps lifecycle. So over on the left, we've got our development lifecycle where we're planning, coding, building. And on the right, we've got our release management where we're deploying and operating those changes and monitoring those changes. So continuous testing is a key component like every other component in that DevOps lifecycle. And if you're doing DevOps and you're not doing continuous testing, then you're not being agile and your DevOps isn't going to succeed. So you need some tool that's going to plug that gap. Otherwise, your manual testing overhead is going to exceed, or your maintenance of a coded framework is going to exceed your capabilities to deliver changes. So Provar can fit into that continuous testing gap. And when it comes to technologies such as Salesforce DX, again, Provar can work with Salesforce DX, but where we operate is over on the right-hand side here, the 3 items on the right. Your developers are still going to use Scratch orgs, going to spin up those Scratch orgs, they're going to make changes in those Scratch orgs, and they're going to push those back. And we're only really interested in testing when they want to commit that code or commit that declarative change back to your deployment. So when they've done their pull request or their commit or any other version control repository, what we want to do is run some tests. We want to validate what they've changed hasn't broken anything. So we run some sort of validation check at that point that's triggered automatically. And then when it comes to putting a release together, so we're maybe releasing into a staging environment or a system test environment for functional testing, we probably want to run your whole regression pack. So again, we want to run our test automations in Provar to run those regression tests and check if there's any other issues that have been detected. And then finally, for UAT, we want to run it in our UAT environment, and we want to give some test evidence to our UAT stakeholders. So they only have to focus on the things that matter to them that have changed in this release, instead of having to sign off that every other change hasn't broken anything that was working before. And then once you push your changes into a training or production org, you probably want to smoke test. So you want to run a limited set of tests that are not destructive around checking that everything's working as expected. Behind all of these, whether you're using Salesforce DX and Scratch orgs or the sandboxes, you're going to have a version control system. How Provar works with this is we allow people to author tests in Provar, and they can commit those changes to a common version control repository, whether that's Git-based on GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, any other tool that you want to use, Subversion, so on and so forth. And then once you've got that in your version control repository, you've got your test cases in there alongside any deployments you're doing, our continuous integration platform. So that can be Salesforce DX, it can be Jenkins, it can be Bamboo, it can be a number of the other Salesforce partners in this space, whether it's AutoRabbit, GearSet, Capado. All of those tools can integrate with Provar Test Automation to run your tests as part of your delivery pipeline. And then there's no point doing our testing if we're not seeing the results. So we need to see those results output, and that can be in the form of a PDF or HTML file, JUnit, which I'm going to demonstrate today, and even a free app on the App Exchange for putting your test results in Salesforce as a dashboard as well. And again, if you're using things like AutoRabbit and Flowsum, you can have those results displayed in those tools. And you can also use those web service APIs I talked about earlier. You can make calls into things like ALM, Jira, Zephyr to update an issue, or to add a comment when a test has failed, or to put some results into those systems as well. So now I'm going to do some demonstrations for you. It's quite lightweight on the demo, so you won't have to focus too hard on this one. I'm mainly going to show you a brief part of how Provar uses version control with things like Git. So we'll see that very quickly, and how we can do team collaboration, and how we create a set of tests. And then I'm really going to look at things like continuous integration platform, in this case Jenkins, and we can look at some of the result reporting options for things like JUnit, PDF, and Salesforce Analytics. If you're interested more around the DevOps side, then please take a screenshot and check out the bit.ly link at the bottom. If you're interested in how you actually structure Provar with Git and the best practice, again, a very good article from our website on that one as well. So I'll just give you a second if you want to take any screenshots on that. Okay, and let's start having a look. So here I'm running Provar, and I've started a new Provar project. So I've joined a Provar test team, and we have a number of options. If I was writing from scratch, I could create a new project. I can also import a project from a file. So when it comes to supporting our customers, they can send us an export of their test project. We can import that into our system, and we can diagnose what the issues are they're facing and recommend better ways of writing their tests. And then finally, what I want to talk about is importing from source control. So if I'm part of a team, I can import a project that's already been created. So I'm not starting from scratch. I'm not having to import zip files from anywhere else. So in this case, what I'm going to do is import my project from Git. I've already cloned that locally, so I'm going to pick local repository, and I'm going to add my standard demo in this one. Pick next, and next again, and I'd only want the last option will be enough for today. So now we're going to see Provar start up. It's going to import a project into the navigator that's already been set up in my Git repository. And we see here we have a number of test cases already set up. And we're already linked into Git, so we're tracking changes against those. So any changes I make locally are chevroned, and I can commit those back and share them. So that's great. It's a great way to sort of explore those tests and share that information, share those test cases with my other QA users. But what about when I want to actually run those tests on a CI server? In this case, what we can do in Provar, we saw about running interactively. I can also generate an ANT file. So what an ANT file really is a description of an environment and a set of tests you want to run. So in this case, I've got a file name called build.xml. I can select the different test cases I want to include from my different folders. I can add that to my test pack. I can choose the browser mode I want to run in. I can choose the different browsers I want to test in as well. So again, I want to create different test packs for different browsers if that's appropriate to my needs. I'm not going to start the execution now, but I am going to just sort of run that to create the build file. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to open that build file up so you can see what's in it. So I'm just going to open that up in Provar, and we can see it's written this file for us. If you're used to Apache Ant already, this should be quite similar to you. We have a target here, and I can edit this further if I wanted to, or make any other changes about how it operates. So now I've got my build file. I'll check that into my Git repository, and I want to pick that up in my CI platform. And my CI platform today is Jenkins. Now I have a lot of jobs here already configured. Some of these jobs are triggered from tools such as Flowsum. So when Flowsum does a deployment, it's able to make a call into Jenkins using an API call, and that triggers the Provar tests, and the results are written back to Salesforce. In my example here, I'm going to look at one we did for Texas Dreaming earlier this year. Apologies, I just logged out. Let's log back in. And what we've got here is a deployment pipeline using Salesforce DX. So we're actually checking out from our version control. We're authenticating with our Salesforce DX Dev Hub. We're creating an org on the fly, and we're pushing deployments to it. And the last step of this is actually Provar is part of this pipeline. That's the key that I want to show you there. And then we're publishing our JUnit test results. So if I go to the last build in this pipeline and I look at the test result for that, I can see that there was 2 tests, what the tests that were created. That's okay, but what's more interesting is I can look at the history of that. And this is using their JUnit XML, and this is how Jenkins has a plugin to display the information. So I'm starting to get some meaningful information here about those tests over time, about different performance times it's taken them to execute, and about the number of passes and fails that I've had in each of those tests. What I can also do, though, is plug my tests into something like Salesforce. So I can write my test results into Salesforce, and then I can analyze using Salesforce dashboards if I'm a Salesforce user. So I can see my recent history, any passes and fails. I'm expecting to see a sawtooth, and I've got one. So what we're seeing here is tests are failing when developers are making changes. Developer then fixes the test case or fixes the code. The test case then passes, or it may be a genuine change and that they haven't informed the test team. I'm sure that never happens. So the test team need to make a change to the test script to pass that development. And then quite useful here, I can see my test cases, and you could group this any way you want to. You could group it by module, you could group it by types of Salesforce profile or user, and I can see where my QA pack is most fragile, so which are the test cases that are failing most often, and I can investigate why is that. Is that because they're fast changing developments, or is that because I haven't written a robust test case in the first place? And then when we look at execution times as well, we can track those, and we can see where we've got any particular spikes, which could be down to performance issues with the platform or the network, or there may be a genuine problem with the application that we've developed that's causing things to take longer, much longer than they did before. Let's just return to the slides then. So the other items we can get reports out is from standard is when I run a test pack, I have the option of producing a PDF or HTML file, as we see here, and that can be emailed to you by the CI platform, or if you run it locally as well. So you can get an overview of the test cases you've executed, the results, and any steps that are performed. And as we just saw, we've got the App Exchange app. A link for that is at the bottom of that screen if you're interested in that app. That's a free app on the App Exchange, currently a private listing, still in security review. And that has a couple of custom objects which can be integrated with Provar, and then a dashboard as a starting point for you to create your own dashboards to review your test results. So just to recap, we saw about version control, how I use the repository to synchronize changes and maintaining my test history or starting a project. We saw with continuous integration, I used Jenkins in that case, but I could easily have used Bamboo. I could have used Bitbucket pipeline. I could use GitLab, the STS, you name it. Pretty much every CI tool in some way can run test automation and do deployments. We also saw working with things like Salesforce DX, which is becoming more and more popular. And then we saw test results in both email, JUnit, or in things like Salesforce, but I could equally have pushed my test results into, say, Jira if I wanted to. And the free app to save results into Salesforce reporting, we'll cover the link again at the end. If you're interested in learning more, then please book a discovery meeting with us. It's free of charge. All we're going to do is go through that. We'll go through requirements, understand your specific Salesforce org, what the applications you're using, and we'll make some recommendations. And those recommendations are typically whether to proceed with something like a proof of concept, where we'll work together to show you some test cases working in one of your sandboxes, or to provide you a trial of Provar working within a restricted environment. If you are interested in that discovery meeting, you can do so in the post-webinar survey, which will be sent at the end of this call, or you can email your interest to info@provartesting.com. I think as well, if you put any questions in the chat window, Hetty will catch that as well. If you express an interest in there or in the questions, we'll certainly pick that up as well. If you just want to learn more about Provar, then we've got some other very good webinars we've done previously. So one on testing Lightning specifically and the differences between testing Lightning and Classic. Another one which goes into more detail, where I showed you today on continuous testing with Provar, which is a short 9-minute video. And then if you're interested in learning more about Salesforce DX, again, we have a short video which takes us through how our testing with Salesforce DX works, how we work with aliasing and scratch orgs as well. Some other further reading, I'll leave this on the screen for a couple of seconds for you to take in a screenshot. So if you're interested in the test integration package, so that's the dashboard within Salesforce, there's a link there to how to install that and set it up with Provar, but you can also go to the App Exchange and find that application and install it free of charge without using Provar. If you understand more about how we use DevOps with Provar, again, there's an interesting article on that. And then finally, the last 2 links are our training guides that you can access that we use within the trials. If you want to understand what the scope of the trials are, what you can do in terms of the data-driven testing, Lightning, and all the other great things you can do with Provar. And finally, have we got any questions, Hetty?
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. We do still have some questions, but I'm afraid we have overrun. So if we haven't been able to answer your question during the session, I do apologise for that. We will make sure we can still see all of your questions. So we'll make sure that we are following up with each and every one of you by email once this session has finished. So thanks again to Richard and Geraint for the presentation today. Just a reminder, if you are interested in booking a discovery meeting with us, then do let us know. You can indicate your interest quite easily in the post-webinar survey, which will be launching right after this webinar finishes. And to those of you asking about recording of this session, yes, it will be up online tomorrow, and I'll send around a link to that to all attendees once that is available. So thanks to everyone for attending today, and thank you once again to our presenters, Geraint and Richard. Bye for now.
Thank you.